Goeiedag, good day, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And once again, this is a huge shout out to Fiona. It's another one of her fabulous stories about understanding the Zulu people, the Zulu psyche, and why they are so culturally diverse to basically European people. I mean, it's really important information and it needs to be put out there. Okay, this is what she says. By the time I was 3, I'd started to teach myself to read. And once I had mastered the skill, I began reading every book in our home. Both Grandpa and Dad had always been prolific readers, and the farmhouse was filled with books, as is my house. Believe me, I've got big bookcases here. Grandpa was such an ardent and omnivorous reader that after he moved onto the farm, he had crates of books sent up from Durban by Oxwagon. They were most of the classics, encyclopedias, as well as more digestible works. Once I was able to read, I started on the bookshelves that lined the long passages to our bedrooms. All the heaviest books lay on the bottom shelves, and at the age of about 4, I dragged out a large tome of Tolstoy's War and Peace, and hauled it down to my bedroom to devour hungrily. My father's taste in literature was inclined to works both factual and fictional. Most of his books were on the subject of both world wars, particularly about flying, as after he had done his stint in the Second World War serving as a pilot in the South African Air Force, looking for submarines between the south coast and Madagascar, he had flown a Maryland bomber with a crew of 7. He had been stationed way up north in the desert, bombing the Italians while the British army, led by General Montgomery, was occupied with fighting Rommel, the German general who was trying to invade North Africa from the top. I loved reading autobiographies of men who served in the British and South African armed forces, picturing their bravery as they fired at the Jerrys while they were under fierce attack themselves. Although I did wonder why the British servicemen used the words muck and mucking around so often. I enjoyed all the works of C.S. Forester and read the Hornblower series over and over again. I loved the Hornblower series. Fabulous books. P.G. Wodehouse was one of his favourites, as my father had the entire collection. On the top shelves stood the children's books, and were the last books I read, having to stand on the big war books to reach them. Various aunts and cousins, some of whom were English, posted us books on our birthdays and for Christmas. I found them disappointing and childish. The famous 5 by Enid Blyton, in my opinion, was simpering Poms, and I couldn't relate to their weedy antics with smugglers and gypsies. My older sister and I jeered at their manners of speech and mocked the way they pulled on coats and boots before going out of doors, but secretly I envied them their exciting sounding schools and being able to play in the snow with friends. I'd always been fascinated by planes of every description, inspired by the fact that Dad had been a pilot, and by reading all his wartime flying books. I became more and more obsessed with flying. I found a beautiful big book called Serengeti Shall Not Die, written by a German man, Bernhard Grimsbeck. Now, that is an amazing book. I was in Serengeti in 2016, and it's quite tragic what's happening. I don't think it's going to survive in reality. Anyway, getting back to what Fiona's saying, I found a beautiful book called Serengeti Shall Not Die, written by a German man, Bernhard Grimsbeck, who had a beef and game ranch alongside the Serengeti Game Reserve in Kenya. They had a son, Michael, who'd been mad about flying and photographing game, and owned his own little Cessna 2-seater, painted in black and white stripes, exactly like a zebra's coat. The book had the most wonderful full-colour illustrations, photos taken by the son, of the various big game animals, as well as herds of zebra and wildebeest, and best of all, it had a full-size photograph of Michael himself in the front piece. Now, talking about planes and game reserves, when I was about 6 years old, we went to the Little Ruaha Game Reserve, where the game warden's name was Steve, and he had a little plane that could take 2 passengers. And we were there for a weekend, and he took us up in this plane, and we flew over herds of elephant, sort of basically swooping down over them. And it was quite incredible. There must have been 40 or 50 elephant in the herd. And they were just running through the bush, knocking down these small trees as they ran to get away from the plane. It was absolutely amazing to actually be there and see this. It was quite extraordinary. Okay, let's get back to the story. Tragically, the book was dedicated to him by his parents, as he had died in his own plane in a crash on the Serengeti at the age of 20. The plane had collided with a vulture. This made me very sad, and I fell in love with his image. Tanned and with his sun-bleached hair blowing in some warm Kenyan breeze, he was leaning against a zebra-striped plane, his blue eyes crinkling attractively against the glare of the African sun. I was mesmerized by his beauty, captured there for eternity, and in some way I felt I owned him, as there would be no girlfriends for him, nor a family life in the future with a wife and children. All this made it safe for me to fall in love with him. Dad had a large collection of autobiographies written by Second World War heroes such as Douglas Bader, among many others, and I devoured them all. I discovered all the encyclopedias and read them from cover to cover, drinking all the knowledge they contained. I also found a book that described Morse code and had all the coded alphabetical signals written down. I copied these out carefully and memorized them. I also found and learnt the air alphabet with far more care than I'd ever put into any of my schoolwork, when I'd eventually get there at the age of 12. Our airstrip on the farm was often used by friends and family members who owned planes, and one, a cousin of my father's, David Carlyle, had been a pilot in the war, flying a bomber alongside Dad. Dave had kept up his license, however, and flew a small 4-seater plane owned by our family firm, W.G. Brown & Co. To my utter disappointment, Dad absolutely refused to buy a plane. He simply said he had had quite enough of flying and been shot at and would never set foot back on a plane, unless he was a passenger. He had been wounded once, but never ever spoke about it. The small Indian-run training store in every town in Zululand and Natal was scattered so far and wide that the company aircraft was the ideal vehicle for Dave to get around, checking that his customers were receiving their orders from W.G. Brown & Co. and were satisfied with the service. Our family, including all our cousins, called him the Flying Grocer. I changed my mind about my future as a vet and decided I was going to be a pilot, preferably a fighter pilot. I kept my aspirations to myself after having mentioned them to Dad one day, but found that he scoffed at the very idea. "All you'll end up is a glorified bus or taxi driver," he sneered, "and the South African Air Force certainly won't take women." He spat the words out. "And the South African Air Force certainly wouldn't take women as pilots." Dad never got over the fact that women had been admitted into Cambridge after he'd left there sometime around 1938. He was utterly disgusted when he received the news in his Jesus College Old Boys magazine. Apoplectic with rage, he ranted about it at the dining room table at every opportunity, right up until we'd grown up, left home and had children of our own. So every time I heard the familiar buzzing noise, I stared up at the sky and watched every plane go by, high overhead. Mentally grasping the joystick, my feet operating the rudders, I daydreamed happily about owning my own little 2-seater zebra-striped Cessna and assiduously practiced my Morse and air alphabet codes. The airstrip was the bane of Dad's life, one of many. The Department of Defense insisted it was kept closely mown and operational, and that the windsock was up and flying at all times. This was in case there was any unrest from Impengele. It lasted the 40-odd years of living under apartheid, and our strip, as well as our new bridge over the Umgeni, the old, rather ramshackle one built by Grandpa, had been washed away by floods in 1957, but it had to be maintained. The Nationalist Party government department replaced our old bridge with a hideous concrete causeway, strong enough to take army tanks. The South African Defence Force needed to be able to go to Impengele, the Zulu location high in the hills behind our farm. Everybody called any African township, small or large, a location. If trouble brewed amongst the natives up there, they wanted to be able to get tanks and aircraft up there to sort the unrest out immediately. By unrest, they meant any uprising and rioting against apartheid. And sorting it out involved tear gas and, as a last resort, shooting rioters, and not necessarily with rubber bullets. Both the airstrip and the bridge were vital access routes to strategic points overlooking the large African settlement, where all our staff came from. Guests and relations who decided to visit us by plane regularly landed on our lovely extra-long airstrip. Dad had to do routine checks for molehills, which would need to be scraped flat before they became hummocks, and dangerous to aircraft taking off or landing. He also needed to check for ant bear holes, as we call them. The aardvarks would come out at night and dig deep holes in the ground as they searched for the delicious termites. To them, and the Zulus anyway. Apparently, according to Dumasani, they tasted of nice, fatty marrow. Aardvarks always infuriated Dad, as they always chose our airstrip to dig their burrows, leaving humps and bumps of earth everywhere, which made the little Cessnas and other small planes that used the strip to lurch all over the place as they taxied to take off and leapt around alarmingly when landing. The other thing that made him so cross was all the hidden holes they left after digging so deep in the long, tawny felt grass. All of us, girls and grooms alike, had to watch out all the time that his polo ponies and our own mounts didn't put a hoof into the hole, causing them to somersault and throw its rider. In our area, ant bear holes were the most common cause of a horse's broken leg. These deep holes needed to be filled in by hand with shovels by his labourers. He also had to see when the grass strip next needed cutting, done by a small team of oxen and the old mower. The biggest problem with the airstrip was posed by our climate. We lived in the mist belt, which meant that when it was overcast over the rest of the Natal Midlands, we would be sitting in dense mist, so thick that you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The mist was always accompanied by a fine, cold drizzle and could persist for 5 days at a time, meaning that anyone who landed was stuck on the farm with no means of getting out until the mist cleared, which could be nearly a week. Dad hated having anyone stay at the best of times, but sometimes they were complete strangers. People used to pop down on our strip on a nice day out, looking at the beauty of the Drakensberg Mountains, and suddenly find themselves stranded in the mist. The mist could come rolling down over the escarpment within the space of an hour or so, and if we were out walking, riding, or driving on the veldt, even we, who knew the area so well, had to find a road quickly, or we could quickly become totally lost for 5 or more days. The temperature dropped immediately, the sun was obliterated by the mist, and it would get as low as freezing point at night. The upshot was that suddenly Dad would find himself playing host for an indefinite length of time to people he neither knew nor liked. His worst nightmare. He would sit there, glowering resentfully, while these people made free with his good whiskey, wine and sherry, while Mum panicked about provisions running out in the kitchen. Fortunately, we usually had a good supply of food off the farm itself, but there could be a danger of running out things like tea and coffee or flour and rice. Those items she would have to order from Hussen's, our Indian-run general dealer, at Nottingham Road, 20 miles away, and they had to be collected. Due to the utter disappointment which my parents always vociferously and openly displayed that they had only ever had 4 girls, I had become a typical tomboy. I strived to be the son that Mum and Dad never had. I rode as soon as I could walk, at the age of 3, perched on the sheepskin saddle in front of Grandpa, enveloped safely in his arms as he rode around his small holding on his retired polo pony. Very soon after, I began to ride old bomb-proof Sonny by myself. I threw myself wholeheartedly into farm life. Whatever was going on, be it herding the cattle and sheep, burning fire breaks, haymaking, or whatever activity was happening at the time, I would be in the midst of it. I knew the name of everybody on the farm, and of all the oxen. Dad refused to buy a tractor until 1969 because of the K factor. He used oxen instead. Our horses and the dogs, and there was very little that I missed as I jumped out of bed to race up to the huts and eat a clandestine breakfast with my Zulu playmates. We kids had to curfew, and the rules were rigid. My mother insisted that we were out of the house straight after breakfast, only to come back at lunchtime to eat in the nursery, before being forced to lie down on our beds for 2 hours during the fiercest heat of the day for an afternoon rest. After that, we had to be out again until dusk, when we had to come back inside, before the resident leopards would start moving about to hunt baboons or any other creature. Our dogs had to be locked up in the big thatched dairy every night, otherwise they would have been taken. Whenever we heard them barking frantically at night, we knew they'd smelled the big cats somewhere nearby. "Frosting away in your room reading," Mum shouted when she caught me, once again lying half-dressed and engrossed in my third read of Reach for the Sky by Douglas Bader. "You're not sick, and it's not rainy or anything. Go outside and play," aiming a vicious slap at my bare legs in her rage. Define play, I would wonder to myself. Sometimes I'd smuggle a book out and go and sit up in a treehouse I'd made, in a gnarled old apple tree, by nailing some pine planks to a branch, but it was neither comfortable nor private. The very best place of all was a nest I'd made for myself in a giant tree fern. It was about 10 feet tall, and by using a boulder right next to it as a step up, I could climb up the woolly trunk and lie comfortably curled up in the soft, almost papery center where the new leaves appeared. The huge fern leaves that grew profusely outwards made me completely invisible, and I never told anyone other than my Zulu friends about it. We weren't allowed to play with Muntu children at all, ever, so I took up an illegal and secret alliance with the Zulu children, with whom I spent the rest of my time, flying under Mum's radar and risking Evelina's job for her on a daily basis. I found it easy to slip away from her every day and play with them. The Zulu children were not allowed anywhere near the house, though, and as I had to shed them at the back gate when I was called to meals by Evelina. Our parents didn't mind if we spent the entire day out in the garden, out of sight and earshot, with our Zulu nannies. In fact, Mum insisted we did so, because it allowed her to focus her full attention on a huge 5-acre garden planted with English flowers, carved out the beautiful, natural, indigenous bush. One day we were sitting next to where the 2 washing and ironing women hung their laundry out to dry on a sagging wire line strung between 2 wonky poles. Our sheets were too big to hang up, were draped over the shaggy kikuyu grass along the path. Minute red ticks climbed into the warm, damp seams and settled there until the sheets were back on our beds. Then they crept out again to lodge their mandibles into our tasty, warm flesh. For years and years, we all suffered from hundreds of tiny itching bites around our pulse points, until our GP asked my father, when his bites had gone septic and turned into a huge abscess, "Where do your servants dry your laundry?" And he had explained about the ticks. So Mum had rather grudgingly arranged for Begindlela to put up another couple of wire lines for our sheets. It was bliss to be able to get into beds after our bath without itching so badly that I sometimes scratched my ankles raw. Oddly enough, ticks never seemed to bother my mother much. I said to Evelina as we sat in the shade of the gum tree, "I was reading a book about the war last night. I didn't know the Zulu for war, so I used the English word." "What is this thing war?" she asked, 2 vertical lines wrinkling her gleaming brown forehead in puzzlement as she threaded a long line of tiny scarlet-coloured beads on a piece of cotton with an embroidery needle. "It's when 2 countries fight over the same land, I think," I said uncertainly. "Anyway, I was reading this book called The Great Escape about prisoners of war." "What are these things, pleasanters?" She carefully tied a knot in the thread and began picking up some yellow beads with her needle. A prisoner is when a person gets caught by others. They put him in a place where he can't escape, and they keep him there for years, and they give him very little food, I expounded, warming to my subject. Why? Interrupted Evelina. We Zulus don't do that. When we catch a man who has done something wrong, we kill him, she said, biting off the thread, her strong white teeth making a sharp snap. Then she turned her beadwork over in her pink palms, inspecting with satisfaction the small square of red, yellow, green and blue beads woven into an intricate pattern she was making. Ubeshu, a little modesty panel worn by Zulu maidens over the nkoto, the female private parts, for one of her young daughters. How? Do you kill them all? I asked, surprised at this revelation. Why? Evelina put the ubeshu down on her lap and leaned back against the warm trunk of the gum tree. Its bark hung down in strips like peeling wallpaper to reveal the smooth, delicate pinkish grey-green skin underneath. Pungent eucalyptus leaves rustled dryly overhead in the hot breeze that meandered through the valley at the time of the afternoon. The rest of the farm lay in its usual soporific state, while everybody slept through the worst of the heat. The Christmas beetles or cicadas were the only creatures that made any noise as they screamed incessantly. Evelina answered, Well now, if a man steals something from a member of the tribe or hurts somebody for no good reason, he's brought before the chief, who with the other elders question him. If he won't speak, they'll fetch the sangoma, the healer, or even Mtagati, the witch doctor who casts evil spells. She stopped speaking and shuddered for a moment, disturbed by the very thought. Then she continued, The witch doctor puts a curse on the man. On the subject of curses, and I just want to put in a little commentary here. My father was a white hunter, and one day he was out in the middle of the bush in the northern part of Mozambique, just hunting, looking for, he was looking for elephants and stuff like this. This is back in about the 1930s, 1940s, long time ago. And he came across this witch doctor. And this witch doctor had a sack over his back. And they sat down, they talked, because my dad spoke fluent Swahili, which is a language up in East Africa that the Africans use. And the witch doctor saw my dad was smoking and said, can I have some cigarettes? So my dad said, sure, but he said, what are you going to give me in exchange? And he said, what's in your bag? And the witch doctor said, I've got some death masks in there, which they used in these, when they do their stuff. And to cut a long story short, Dad exchanged a carton of cigarettes for 5 death masks. And I've inherited them. And here is a genuine death mask. You can see it's of a Negro. It's carved out of baobab. You can see it's got a buckskin head. And you can see that you can wear it. So I can put this in front of my face or over my face, and it had a Hessian back originally. But that's the Negro one, and this is, I think, a Congolese type one. But again, this is for another person that he was going to put a death spell on. And these casting of spells are very, very powerful when it comes to the Africans. When the African who's had a spell cast on him knows that he's actually been, he's had a spell cast by the witch doctor, they literally go into shock. They can't eat. They literally die because they are so, they believe so sincerely in the magic of the witch doctor, that they have that power over them. That's why Evelina in the story would have such a huge problem dealing with talking about the Sangoma or the witch doctor, because they literally have the power to, determine whether they live or die. And these death masks are just proof of the witch doctor's trade, I guess. All right. I know that's a bit of a a diversion from the story, but I wanted to give some meat to the bone, because witchcraft and casting spells and all that sort of stuff isn't just isolated to the Zulu nation. It's right across the tribes of Africa. It's a huge part of their culture. And the witch doctors who create these sort of masks and perform the rituals they're absolutely beautiful masks, as you can see. I mean, they're absolutely gorgeous. Look at that profile. Isn't that fantastic? But someone has literally died because of that mask that the witch doctor once wore. This is about 100 years ago now, I guess. But that gives you a bit of background to this whole idea of the spells and the power of the witch doctor. So that he has to tell the council all his wrongdoings, and the chief then speaks to his elders. Then they hold an indaba, or meeting, and decide whether they should punish him or not. If the crime is not a bad one, they let the man go, making sure he is very frightened. But if it is a serious one, they put him to death. The Induna tells one of his warriors to run a spear through his heart, or sometimes they throw him off a cliff to his death, like Shaka used to do with his enemies in my great-grandfather's day. "Isn't that very cruel?" I asked, my eyes big with alarm. "No," said Evelina emphatically. "That means the end of the problem. Just think about it. If the tribe has to keep a man prisoner, they would have to first dig a deep pit, one with very steep sides that he cannot climb out of and run away. Then somebody, a woman, has to cook food for him and take it to him 3 times a day. She also has to take away his waste." She pulled down her mouth and shook her head at the thought. "It would be a drain on the strength of the tribe, especially as you know, every few months we have to move on to find better grazing and game. If the prisoner does manage to escape, he will have a grudge against his people forever, and he will be a very dangerous man. No, it's better that he's put to death straight away. It's the same thing with old people, those who are too weak to help gather food or hunt. When they can no longer walk, we carry them out beyond the boma, or the thorn enclosure, out to where the hyenas will take them during the night." Evelina sat here for a moment deep in thought, and then with one hand picked up her ubeshu again, and with the other she began scratching around in her handmade reed basket for another packet of beads. "Every member of a Zulu tribe has to serve a purpose," she said, holding a cellophane bag of white beads up to the light and scrutinizing it through narrowed eyes. She then selected a handful and began to thread them carefully onto a needle and cotton. She continued, "They have to be able to move on with the others to new hunting grounds and bring food back to the huts. If they can't, then they are useless and make the tribe vulnerable by having to stay behind to look after them. The weak and frail have to be dispatched. Sick people, very old people, and even babies get taken out beyond the boma as night falls, so lions or hyenas can take them away." "Babies!" I exclaimed in horror. "Why babies?" I sat up from the soft tuft of kikuyu grass where I'd been lying, forgetting that I was almost certainly attracting those tiny red pepper ticks who lurked on its blades, just waiting for such an opportunity. "Twin babies," explained Evelina impassively. "If a woman gives birth to twins, the tribe sees it as a curse put on her by Mtagati. They'll take away the smaller of the weaker baby, wrap it up in a grass mat, and leave it out beyond the boma for the night predators to eat." I wriggled uneasily on the grass tussock, and it was not from the thought of ticks crawling into my brooks. That explained why I'd never seen twins among the numerous Zulu children I played with every day. I had twin cousins, though, whom I met now and again at polo tournaments, a boy and a girl about 2 years younger than I was. Wow, I thought, imagine if they'd been Zulus. "What if the mother of the twins wanted to keep both babies?" I asked, perplexed. "Could she hide one of her babies and say she'd only had one?" "How? No," exclaimed Evelina. "The mother of those twins would be as frightened as the rest of the tribe. And anyway, how could she hide a baby away forever? The people would find it soon. Come now, the sun is getting low in the sky. It's your bath time. We must now see if you've picked up any ticks where you've been sitting in that long grass. She packed away her beadwork and heaved herself to her feet, brushing dust off the seat of her navy uniform skirt with both hands. I followed her down the narrow earth path, carved over the years by many bare feet of so many of our workers. The washwoman, Masanga, when he walked up to the chicken run to kill a fowl for lunch, Makaya, who fed the fowls and then put them to bed each night, secure behind strong wire netting in the corrugated iron hut, so that they'd be safe from jennets and water mongoose, who would slip in through the tiniest hole in a wire cage and kill the lot. Now, okay, probably the most important part of that article from Fiona is that latter piece where she's describing how the Zulus treat their own. Life is very cheap among the Zulu people, and you know, we've had so many videos on here where someone who's done something wrong is caught by other members of the community in a township. They're stoned and then necklaced with petrol and stuff like that. That is part of the culture. It's nothing unusual amongst the Zulu community. Life is very cheap. I remember when I grew up in Greytown, this is back in the 1970s. Yeah, 1970s. And I have told this story before, but I'll tell it again. My mother was the PA, or personal assistant, to the town mayor in Greytown. And often early in the morning we'd hear army helicopters go over, because Greytown's right up in the northern part of KwaZulu-Natal. And just 20 kilometers away you've got the Chigela River. And what happened, especially over the Christmas break, was that you'd have two villages, both Zulu villages. One might have 100 people, another one might have 50 people or whatever, and someone in one village would feel that for some reason he had been treated badly by someone in the other village, and the entire village on this side would actually go and during the night slaughter everybody in the other village. This happened in the 1970s. We're not talking 1800s. This is in the 1970s. It probably still happens now. But it's the way of life. They would literally pick up pangas and knobkerries and all this sort of stuff, surprise the other village, kill everybody, come back home, and then the next morning the army would have to go over to sort out the mess. This is how cheap life is amongst the Zulu people. And it's still very much like that. This is something that I, as a white person, find very hard to accept. I could never do that. But culturally, it's what they do. This is why there's such a huge divide between generally the white population and the black population. And it comes back to this cultural thing, the way they react to circumstances happening around them. All right, guys, please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Ring the bell for the updates. Please like this video. Please share this video. And above all, please stay safe.